Okay, so we are moving on to chapter 17, the lymphatic and immune system. Okay, so the lymphatic system is kind of spread out throughout the body. It's very similar to the circulatory system in terms of its distribution, and a lot of portions of it function very similar to our circulatory system. But our lymphatic system has our lymphatic vessels, the lymph, which is the actual fluid in the vessels, just kind of like how we have our blood that flows through our arteries and veins. We have lymph that flows through our lymph vessels. We have lymphatic tissues, and we also have lymphatic organs like the spleen and the thymus. So the vessels of our lymphatic system, like I said, they cover the body just like our blood vessels, but they only have a unidirectional flow. So they flow back towards the heart. Our arteries and veins obviously flow away from the heart and back towards it. The lymphatic system only flows towards it. And so the main kind of function of our lymphatic system is to produce immune cells and assist our immune system in functioning properly. Okay, so like I said, this bottom one here, immunity. So they filter that lymph and try to remove pathogens. There's some other aspects to our lymphatic system related to immunity that we'll discuss. Absorption of fat. This occurs in our small intestine. We're not going to talk too much about that one besides just knowing it exists. And then maintenance of fluid balance. So it returns fluids to the heart that leak out of the bloodstream. So that fluid that gets filtered by the lymphatic system ends up going back to the heart. But kind of how much it returns can influence our total kind of volume of fluid in the body. Okay, so zooming in on the lymphatic vessels themselves, they have very thin walls formed by epithelial cells. And part of the reason why there's such a thin wall is because there's a lot of diffusion happening. And so fluid actually can enter these vessels between our overlapping epithelial cells. There's valves, just like our veins, that prevent the backflow. And we also have proteins that are kind of considered anchors, and it'll kind of tie our cell to surrounding cells. So it helps our lymphatic vessels stay where they need to go and stops them from collapsing at all. Okay, so our lymphatic circulation, there's a little bit of an animation on this whole process here, but like similar to the venous system, kind of vessels converge to form larger and larger vessels as it's flowing back towards the heart. And in the lymphatic system, every so often, there's actually what's known as a lymph node. And so this is where our immune cells or our white blood cells phagocytize the bacteria. So these vessels will continue to merge until they form what's known as a lymphatic trunk. And so these are much larger vessels that are going to drain towards the heart. So you see that the lymph node is that little dot here, and these larger vessels are the lymphatic trunks. So we join our lymph back to the bloodstream at the collecting ducts and subclavian veins. And so the lymph fluid moves passively. It doesn't take energy to get our lymph back to the heart. Similar to the veins, rhythmic contractions of our vessels by smooth muscle, that muscular pump and the respiratory pump also help our lymph fluid flow back to the heart as we need it. Okay, so we just talked about those collecting ducts. You don't necessarily need to memorize this distribution at all, but we have a right lymphatic duct and we have a thoracic duct that drain different aspects of the body. Okay, so the lymphatic tissues themselves, these are kind of patches of specialized tissue throughout the body. We'll talk about a couple locations for them. And they actually are kind of the homes of some of our lymphocytes. So we have two main types of lymphocytes, our T and our B cells. And so they protect our body against foreign invaders. We also have macrophages. Those are one of our phagocytic cells to digest bacteria and foreign matter. We also have dendritic cells, same thing, helps engulf foreign substances, and they also help activate our T cells. So our lymphocytes, besides those kind of specialized patches, can also be in the mucus linings. So they're known as mucus associated or mucosa associated lymph tissue or MALT tissue. And in general, our lymphocytes and our lymphatic tissues have the primary function of protecting our body against invaders. Okay, so our tonsils are actually a part of our lymphatic system. And most people are not familiar with this, but there's actually three different types of tonsils. So your first one is the pharyngeal tonsil. That's known as your adenoids, if you've ever heard that term. And they're just on the wall of your pharynx behind the nasal cavity. You then have your palatine tonsils. Those are the ones that lie in the back of our oral cavity, and those are the ones that are most often removed when you hear people getting their tonsils taken out. And then we have a whole bunch of lingual tonsils that are on the back of the tongue. And so these tonsils are actually, like I said, they're masses of lymphoid tissue, and they kind of form a circle of protection in the back of the throat. So pathogens that may want to enter through our nose or our mouths can get caught by these tonsils. Um, and so you see that there's this rough surface, and all these ridges are known as tonsillar crypts. And the bacteria, viruses, whatever we're not supposed to ingest, kind of get stuck in those ridges and then dealt with our white blood cells. Okay, the appendix is another part of our lymphatic system, as well as Peyer's patches are some of those patches of specialized tissues. And those are found in the small intestine. Remember, we talked about the MALT tissues. We also have GALT tissues, which are gut-associated lymphatic tissue. So the MALT is in the mucus linings, while the GALTs are in the gut tissue, in this case, the small intestine. And so they're still playing defense. They're protecting and preventing the growth of harmful bacteria. When we do end up getting a foreign invader, we have specialized cells within our Peyer's patches that can deal with that tissue or trigger those lymphocytes and macrophages to respond and get rid of them. Okay, so almost all the lymphatic organs are well defined and have a fibrous capsule that surrounds them. We have both primary and secondary organs. And so what defines it as a primary organ is that it actually has stem cells that will end up maturing into our lymphocytes. So our primary lymphatic organs include the thymus and the red bone marrow, whereas our secondary lymphatic organs are still very important in our lymphatic system, but they already have mature lymphocytes that are already active or becoming active. So that could be a lymph node or the spleen are our two main examples there. So first review question here, what forms the basis of lymphatic fluid? The answer here is A, tissue fluid left behind from capillary exchange. And so lymphatic fluid is kind of what's left over from filtering out all the gases and nutrients and stuff that happens in capillary exchange. All right, our thymus. We mentioned this in a previous chapter, but we're going to talk about it in relation to our immune function here. So our thymus produces our T cells. So these are our attack cells. They're super, super important. And so what happens is our immature T cells will go from the red bone marrow to the outer part of the thymus. Inside the thymus, they're kind of in training mode. They're protected from any antigens in the blood. And as they kind of travel towards the middle of the thymus, more mature cells kind of teach them what is supposed to be in the body and what is not supposed to be in the body. And then kind of once they migrate from the outside to the inside, they know how to do their job, and then they're released back into the bloodstream so they can go to whatever tissue needs it. So when we're younger, our thymus is much, much more active and actually a lot larger relative to our heart and lungs, as you see kind of from the left, that pretty large thymus gland compared to your heart and lungs versus how tiny it is when we get full grown. So it starts shrinking at about age 14, and that'll continue to shrink as we get older. And so rather than being that functional tissue that is training our T cells, it just kind of turns into fat and fiber. Um, and so as it shrinks, we get fewer new T cells. And so the less T cells we have, of course, the less we can fight off foreign invaders. So this probably can explain partly why the elderly are more susceptible to infection, and why a lot of chronic diseases such as cancer, and diabetes and that of the such can be a lot more prominent in our elderly individuals. Okay, so we're zooming in even further now on the lymph node itself. And like we said, a lot of our lymph organs have this fibrous capsule that surrounds the outside. And so you guys don't need to know anything super in depth from this stuff. I just wanted to go over it and give you guys kind of the idea of how the lymph node does its job. So it's almost divided into compartments. These divisions are known as trabeculae, or the tissue that divides it are called trabeculae. And so each compartment itself is a cortical nodule, and that has our lymphocytes. So that has our white blood cells, T cells and B cells that actually fight off the foreign invaders. And then here in this lighter purple, that's your germinal center. And that's what actually can kind of form and release the lymphocytes we need. Our sinuses here in the lymph node have our macrophages. Remember, those are highly phagocytic. So they're looking for anything they can eat up. And then we have some afferent vessels. So that's what brings our fluid into the node. Afferent arrives. We have our efferent vessels carrying that fluid out after it's filtered and dealt with by everything in there. Okay, lymphadenopathy. So the term or the suffix pathy is always going to be some kind of issue or disease in a sense. So when the lymph is filtering through the lymph node, it has antigens, and so those lymphocytes within the lymph node kind of respond to the antigens, resulting in a larger node because we have more lymphocytes in it. So the enlargement of a lymph node is what is known as that lymphadenopathy. And so this tends to happen when you have some kind of infection, something that causes the lymph node to respond and produce more white blood cells. Every once in a while, this could be due to something more serious, such as cancer. And so that's kind of why your doctors, when they feel around your neck in certain areas, they're feeling for your lymph nodes. And so different feelings or kind of responses to that palpation of the lymph node can mean different things. You don't need to memorize this. I just wanted to introduce you guys to the concept. Okay, the spleen. This is the body's largest lymph node, even though it's only about the size of a fist. It's in our upper left quadrant. Like our other ones, it's surrounded by that big fibrous capsule. And the spleen itself, we talk about in kind of two different types of tissue. We have our red pulp and our white pulp. So the red pulp sits at the edges of the compartment. And so that's where we have a bunch of our red blood cells in the venous sinuses. So that's our blood supply primarily, whereas our white pulp has a bunch of our lymphocytes. So that's our immune tissue, and those actually surround the arteries. So our spleen has a few different functions. We've been talking about our immune kind of function in general, so that's probably its primary job. So it has a whole bunch of lymphocytes and macrophages in that white pulp that are kind of paying attention to what's going on in our arteries passing through. It destroys our old blood cells. So the macrophages remove, kind of digest the old red blood cells. So that they recycle some of the parts that they can and get rid of the parts that we can't recycle in the body. any platelets that are not functioning properly, and like I said, we recycle the hemoglobin. It also stores a lot of blood. So about 20 to 30% of the platelets in our body are not in circulation. They're just being held in the spleen for when we need them. And then hematopoiesis, as we develop, the spleen is responsible for a large production of red blood cells. All right, next review question. In which lymphatic organ do our T cells mature? The thymus. We just talked about this not too long ago. So they start in the bone marrow and then they travel to the thymus to actually mature and get trained. Okay, we have a few different forms of our defense system. So our lymphatic system is that whole pathway, all the lymph vessels that circulate the unidirectional circulation. The immune system is a bit broader than that. So the lymphatic system plays a large role in our immune system, but our immune system expands beyond the lymphatic system itself. So we talk about the immune system in a few different ways. This first way, we're going to classify it as kind of three different lines of defense. So our first line of defense are external barriers. So our skin is the primary one for that. Our second line of defense is what's known as our non-specific immunity. We're born with this. This is not something that we have to learn how to use. It just is there innately. And this is more of a broad range of mechanisms. So we're not necessarily going after one specific invader. This is kind of a more of a coverall. And then our third layer is when we do get into that specific stuff where we have a memory of a specific pathogen or antigen that our antibodies can recognize and attack specifically. Okay, so some examples of non-specific immunity include external barriers or that first line of defense, phagocytosis as a general kind of concept, our antimicrobial proteins. There's certain proteins that can identify and destroy cells that aren't supposed to be there. Natural killer cells we'll talk about a little bit more. The inflammatory response is not specific, and then the process of fever or febrile response is also considered part of non-specific immunity. Okay, so this is just a little bit of a diagram on phagocytosis. So we've talked about phagocytosis in a few different chapters. Remember, that's kind of like eating or ingesting something, in this case, a bacteria. So our most important phagocytes are macrophages and neutrophils. That you definitely should know. Those are the two most important by far. And so they usually are stationary. Macrophages themselves are stationary. So the lungs, the liver, a lot of areas where we get a high amount of blood through in exchange, we're going to find the most macrophages. Our neutrophils, on the other hand, are going to be more in the circulation, and they're kind of seeking to destroy. And so they're kind of always around, and they can be summoned to certain areas by kind of like a chemical magnet that's known as chemotaxis. And so the inflamed cell will secrete a chemical. That chemical will attract the neutrophils, and they'll eat their way through the cell wall or the basement membrane and pop out to do their job. Okay, the antimicrobial proteins we're talking about, we have two different classes. You have interferons, which are going to be more against viruses, and you have the complement system, which is more against bacteria. You don't need to know the ins and outs of this stuff. Just know that that's part of our non-specific immune system. All right, next review question. Which is an important white blood cell that travels throughout the bloodstream seeking out bacteria? So we just talked about two of our main ones. So the key word here is it travels. The correct answer would be C, neutrophils. Remember, our macrophages are very phagocytic, but they are more stationary. They're in those high traffic areas. Phagocytes is a more general term for a white blood cell that'll ingest a microorganism, and a phagosome is the actual sac that's formed around the bacteria when it's ingested. Okay, so we would touch on natural killer cells again. So they're a group of lymphocytes, so they're kind of a classification of lymphocytes. They also roam the body like neutrophils do, and they have a few different methods for destroying cells, um, mostly involving what's known as lysis, or kind of secretion of chemicals to actually dissolve the materials and destroy them. Okay, this is a little bit of a diagram, or an explanation of the whole process of the inflammatory response. So I do not think you need to know this quite as in depth as this diagram, um, but I do want you to know the four classic signs of inflammation. So you should definitely know those and understand that kind of the phagocytes are going to migrate to the area that the inflammatory response is occurring in. And a large majority are going to die at that site and form a debris. That's what causes pus. And so if pus really accumulates, we end up getting an abscess. But the main thing I want you to know about inflammation for this chapter is these four classic signs, and knowing that inflammation is really the start or the of the healing process. Okay, fever. This is our final one for non-specific immunity, I believe. Um, so you should kind of understand these steps here. So our neutrophils and macrophages end up secreting what's known as a pyrogen. That pyrogen, as it cycles around, will then trigger the hypothalamus, which secretes prostaglandin E, or PGE. So PGE, its job is to reset our body temperature. And so, sorry, excuse me. I should backtrack for a second. Everyone should know that our body's kind of set temperature, or normal temperature, is 98.6. When it goes above that, that's what triggers the pyrogen to be secreted. So the hypothalamus secretes PGE, and then PGE kind of triggers everything to say, hey, we need to reset back to that temperature. So after whatever is causing that initial increase, our phagocytes stop producing that pyrogen. Kind of the only thing remaining is the PGE, and so everything goes back to normal. But by raising the temperature, the body's kind of trying to make it an uninhabitable environment for whatever is invading. All right, question 4 here. Which statement about non-specific immunity is true? A, it's acquired immunity. B, offers protection against a particular pathogen. C, present at birth. Or D, retains a memory of a pathogen after defeating it. The correct answer here is C, it's present at birth. So non-specific immunity is present at birth. It's not acquired. Okay, so specific immunity can be classified into active or passive. So active meaning the body's going to make its own antibodies, or those T cells, or passive meaning we got an injection, say a vaccine, or we received a blood transfusion, something that contained artificial antibodies or antibodies from outside the body. So you should know these kind of classifications here. So the two active, like we said, those are our body making antibodies. So natural active, following exposure to a specific antigen, that's kind of we get exposed to something that isn't supposed to be there, or that's an irritant. We make antibodies to respond to that. Same thing can happen with a vaccination. We get a vaccination that introduces an antigen, and we make antibodies in response to that. Passive, or natural passive, this could be stuff we acquire from our mom. So our blood flow from our mom already has antibodies present, so we get to share in those antibodies, but we're not making them ourselves. And then artificial passive, so this is not coming from a blood to blood contact in terms of mother to child, but say a blood transfusion that you may receive that would contain antibodies um, that you obviously did not make yourself. And we can also break it down into cellular or cell mediated immunity versus humoral or antibody mediated. So this just shows another breakdown of our T cells versus our B cells. So our T cells are our attacker cells. They come from our stem cells in the bone marrow. They actually mature and train in the thymus gland, and then they're going to travel to other organs and tissues where they're needed to be put to work. Our B cells, on the other hand, are going to develop in the red bone marrow and continue to mature there. And then they also will travel to the lymphatic tissues. So our T cells are our attacker cells, and our B cells are more the memory cells. The antibodies themselves are known as immunoglobulins, or IG is the abbreviation for that. They're proteins formed by these B cells. And so remember, our B cells are our memory cells, so they have these antibodies that they can create so that they can recognize antigens when appropriate. They have 5 different classes, which are classified by letter. IgG being the most common in terms of kind of volume of circulation. And so remember, the antigen ends up bonding with the antibody, and that's what triggers our immune response. So each antibody is specific for a specific antigen. So our cellular immunity is referring to destroying pathogens within a cell. So this is what really utilizes our T cells. So the cytotoxic T cells are what actually carry out our attack. Our helper Ts are really supporting the cytotoxic T cells, and the memory T cells are there for future infections. So they play a role very similar to our B cells. All right, this is just a little more in-depth diagram. Okay, humoral immunity is more of an indirect attack on our pathogens, and it's more outside of the cell versus inside of the cell. So it still uses antibodies to mark the antigen for later destruction, or at times you'll see a binding onto the surface of a pathogen, which will stop it from entering the cell. So if it can't get into a cell, it really is not any threat anymore. So this is a little bit more of an in-depth diagram of humoral. Okay, allergic reactions are also antibody mediated. So this one is immunoglobulin E. So the very first time we're exposed to something that we're allergic to, our body is going to produce IgE. You can almost think of this very similar to the RH factor concept that we talked about with blood types. So very first exposure, we just produce the antibody for that allergen. So the next exposure, we already have our antibodies. So the allergen is introduced, it binds to those antibodies, and that results in mast cells releasing histamine, which is part of our inflammatory response. And that's what gives us all those things like a runny nose, our eyes water, we're stuffed up, we might have the hives, whatever it is because the allergen is now bonded with IgE. And so if we have a really severe reaction to something, we call that anaphylaxis. So nothing you need to know in depth, but just want to touch on autoimmune diseases. This is when our antibodies attack our body's own tissues. So the same systems we just talked about, except for they're starting to recognize things that should be there as foreign. Then we have immunodeficiency disorders. So autoimmune is the body's own immune system is attacking. This is a kind of a lack of an immune system. So we have severe combined immunodeficiency disorder. This is when we don't have the B and T lymphocytes to create that immune response. HIV is one of the largest, kind of most popularly talked about ones. And when HIV progresses to a certain point, is then known as AIDS, or acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. All right, I think this is our last bit to touch on. So with organ transplant, um, the biggest risk is a tissue rejection reaction. So oftentimes, when you're doing an organ transplant, you're taking something from someone else and putting it into a new body. And so that the person receiving the organ, their system has to accept it. Oftentimes, I shouldn't say often, but the major risk is that when that new organ is put in, the body kind of senses that as a foreign invader and attacks it. So that's why they talk about finding a match with people. So they're trying to match your genetics or kind of your code up as much so that when they put that new organ in, the body doesn't say, hey, this isn't supposed to be here, this isn't mine, and our immune system doesn't respond to it. All right, last review question to finish up with here. Which type of immunity uses T cells to destroy pathogens within a cell? So that's going to be A, cellular immunity. So remember, humoral immunity is going to focus on pathogens outside of a cell. The passive immunity is receiving antibodies from another person or animal in some way. And our non-specific immunity has a wide variety of stuff related to fighting off invaders, but is not specific to T cells. All right, thank you guys.